Just before we get into the main episode, a quick message from a friend of OnFARM recorded in her tractor cab.
Hello, my name is Katie Brisbane and I am a project coordinator for RET, the Royal Highland Education Trust. We work to give children a greater understanding of food, farming and the countryside. This year we have a focus on the journey of food, seeds and grains, highlighting all the great things produced by Scotland's soils. If you're a farmer or work in a rural business and you'd like to get involved, to volunteer or sponsor our work, we'd love to hear from you. We also have a huge range of educational resources on the website. If you know any teachers or educators who might appreciate them, you can find out more at www.red.org.uk.
Hello and welcome to OnFARM. I'm Anna Davis and this is our last episode before we take a few weeks off for a Christmas and New Year break. But we do have a potential stocking filler idea for you, so keep listening. Joe Stanley is a mixed farmer from Leicestershire and a regular columnist for the Farmers Weekly and the NFU Countrywide magazine. He's also published a book called Farm to Fork, The Challenge of Sustainable Farming in 21st Century Britain. It's a last-minute Christmas idea for the farmer in your life, but as we discuss in this episode, you might even be better buying a copy for someone not involved with food production. So here he comes, Joe Stanley.
I was born into a family farming situation, as you know, so many in the industry are, I suppose. So we had a tenanted 750-acre farm in northwest Leicestershire, and at the time, we were dairy, we were arable, we were beef, we had sheep. Then over the years, we became big arable contractors, and then we shrank back down again just to our own area. The dairy cows, unfortunately, went in the mid-2000s. Now my family farm is, arable and beef, longhorn suckler herd, pedigree longhorn suckler herd. But yeah, I've been farming now since I was in my mid-20s. So initially, I didn't want to become a farmer, to be honest. I wanted to go off and do other things. So I did things completely outside of the farming industry. I did a history degree, and then I did several jobs completely not related to farming before I finally came back to the family farm in my mid-20s. And I've been a farmer now for 12 years. So it wasn't love at first sight, if you like, when it came to me and farming.
But there was obviously something drawing you back. And having explored other options and done other things, there must have been some sort of cord pulling you back to the farm. Do you think there was?
That's right, and I think that's it was good, it was nice, and I think it was very healthy to get out and to try other things, to experience sort of a life perhaps outside of the family farm. But yeah, ultimately, of course, there is always that incredibly deep emotional connection. Obviously, anyone who's grown up on a farm will know that, it's not just where you live. It's a sense of place and belonging and purpose, and that really deep connection to you feel like you're a part of the land. So no, ultimately, I was drawn back to the farm. Ultimately, again, although perhaps I went back with a bit of trepidation, obviously I did in the end, fall in love with farming. And with the really positive story that we have to tell around that in this country. It's great to be a part of such a positive and really central, an industry which is really central to our health and well-being and, our ability to ultimately to function as a society and as a civilization. Farming is really, it's the biggest and most important job on earth, isn't it?
Completely agree. And you used a word there which is kind of one of my favourite words in relation to all things rural, actually, and particularly in relation to the podcast, and that is the word story. You also talked about emotional connection to the land, and I think every farm and every farmer has a story, and if we're wanting other people to understand who we are and what we do and why we do it, telling that story is the best way to connect to them, I think. So you were farming, but I understand that you then also, as well as the other hats you wear, but you then also got into a bit of writing and column writing. So can you tell us a bit about that journey? Yeah, sure.
So the first 6-7 years after I came back to the farm, I didn't do anything whatsoever off the farm. I just, kept my head down, worked, and that was all I did. And I think, really, looking back, I had a huge lack of self-confidence that I had, any ability to take part in the wider industry, frankly, other than, just working. There was sort of one point where I signed up to do the National Farmers Union and Openfield do a cereals development programme. It's for younger people within the industry to get a wider look at the cereal supply chain. And I did that, and that really did sort of spark in me a desire to get more involved with the industry. And I sort of started quite small, writing letters to the Farmers Weekly, mostly just disagreeing with things that some of the existing columnists were saying. And after they'd printed about 7 or 8 of my letters, I quite cheekily then wrote to the Farmers Weekly and said, "Well, look, I keep writing to you and you keep publishing my stuff. So why don't you just give me a writing job?" And bizarrely, thank you very much still to him, the editor at the time, said, "Well, fine, yeah, we'll give you one of the opinion column slots at the Farmers Weekly," which is, of course, that's a great honour to have one of those positions. And at the time, of course, I was just a very young, completely unknown young farmer. And thank you very much again to the Farmers Weekly for giving me that opportunity. And then, of course, one thing always leads on to another, and picking up various other writing jobs. The other one I'm most proud of is actually for the NFU has a magazine called Countryside, and that's a public-facing magazine with a circulation of around 50,000 that the NFU produces to inform the interested general public, the non-farming public, about what goes on in the British countryside. And it's great, again, to have that, which is a very different platform to, obviously Farmers Weekly is very much speaking to farmers, and this is very much a way to explain what we do and why we do it to the great British public. And I really value the ability to be able to do that.
So interestingly, you said there, because I think many people, not everybody would vocalise this, but many people would share your view that actually at first you didn't have a huge amount of confidence that you had anything to offer beyond being able to farm. And do you think being able to express your opinion in the Farmers Weekly column, do you think that improved your confidence and made you realise that actually your opinions are completely legitimate and valid?
Well, absolutely. In terms of there is, my opinions are as legitimate and valid as absolutely anybody else's within the industry. I suppose I was just cheeky enough to try and get into a position where I could impose them on other people. But going back slightly to what you said before regarding self-confidence, I think that is a huge problem within our industry for the younger generation coming through, perhaps most specifically. You meet an awful lot of young people who are used to not being asked their opinion and to not being asked to really have any input perhaps into the management decisions which are taking place in the businesses that they're involved with. And I don't think that is a healthy position for the industry to be in. I think that as an industry, there are some people who are trying really hard to try and bring young, fresh talent into both, the management and leadership of their own businesses, but also the wider industry. That is so important. I think it's all too easy, perhaps, to see a bit of a gentrification of leadership positions, always the same people, the same faces, the same opinions. There is a lot of young, fresh, hungry talent out there that perhaps just doesn't feel that they are valued and that they have anything to contribute, or are welcome to try and offer anything. And I think that is a significant problem which we do need to address within the industry.
Yes, I agree. And what's interesting also is that we've done a few episodes recently about women in agriculture, and that's a huge issue. The confidence thing and what's known as imposter syndrome is a huge thing amongst women in agriculture. But I think many women in agriculture have perhaps wrongly assumed that it's more often women that suffer from this, and kind of assume that many men have got confidence in spades. And it's interesting to hear you say that's not true. And as I say, perhaps not all men will vocalise it in the way that you've been able to, but it's probably more common than we realise, and that actually we're all in a similar boat, which in a way is not good, but at the same time it's reassuring that anybody lacking in confidence is not alone, and that we're all sharing some of that same lack belief.
No, absolutely. And I would just encourage anyone who, obviously, if you don't have any aspirations to do anything other than work hard and be your own boss and to just live a good life, then that's great. But if you do, if you would like to grow within the industry or within your own business, I would just encourage anyone to do that, to follow your own ambitions. There is absolutely no reason why any one of us shouldn't be able to fulfill our full potential. Basically, don't be put off by other people perhaps suggesting that you should, I suppose to put it very bluntly, know your place.
Yeah, and speaking on a personal level, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, actually, because they say that there's a book in everybody, and I would love to write a book. I have a novel in my head. None of it's on paper yet. And so I'm always in awe of people who have translated that desire to write a book and the ideas and thoughts and views in their head and actually sat down and done something about it. So can you tell us, obviously you were becoming more familiar with writing, doing the Farmers Weekly column and the NFU thing. But how did the book journey evolve? How did you get from embryonic thoughts of I'd like to write a book to actually sitting here talking to me today when you Google it, it comes up on Amazon, Waterstones, everywhere possible. So it's getting out there, and I'd love to hear the journey of it.
No, it is fun, and to be fair, I've been sent pictures by a few people from, for example, someone from a Waterstones in the middle of London. There was a whole table full of my books, which was, that's just amazing. Wonderful to see. I've only seen it myself in one bookshop, but I got I played it very, very, very cool, and I stood there posing with it, obviously. Very cool. No, absolutely. I've always enjoyed writing. Since I was a little boy, I used to write novels, mostly Star Wars fan fiction, if I recall. I always thought that was going to be what I was going to get published. I've always wanted to write a book, and it's been one of my big ambitions in life. But the idea of the book I've had for a few years, and it was basically, you go into a bookshop, there's always a table of books in there about the environment, about nature, and about very sort of tenuously farming in the UK. And there's a lot of material out there, but what I noticed was there's a huge amount of material, if you like, told from the non-farmer's perspective around essentially wilding and that sort of thing, all about sort of the natural world in the British countryside, and generally speaking, how farmers are trashing it, and how we should sort of be very sceptical about British agriculture. At the other end of the spectrum, there's actually a very strong genre about upland sheep farming. There's an awful lot of books about that. And I think that's really made a connection with the British public, that this sort of, if you like, harking back to an older way of doing things is really, and we obviously see most strongly with James Rebanks, who's gone on to huge success as a result of his two books. And, they're great books. But there was nothing about, if you like, in inverted commas, modern and essentially, lowland mixed farming. Where could any member of the public go if they wanted to read about arable farming today, or if they wanted to read about dairy farming? For the most part, people who are looking for that sort of information would probably end up on the Guardian website reading articles which are certainly not written from a farmer's perspective, and very commonly not particularly accurate about what British farmers do, why we do it, and the impact of that. So I just had this idea that, I enjoy writing, I enjoy communicating with the public, I'm passionate about getting the positive story of British agriculture out there to people. So yeah, I just thought, well, I will write this book about, the average British lowland farm, dairy, beef, arable, a bit of sheep, and just to try and explain to the non-farming public, the basics of what it is we do, when we do it, why we do it, and why that should matter to them. Because, of course, if people aren't aware of even the basics of what we do in this country when it comes to food production, how can they care about it? How can they care about all the changes that are happening with agriculture at the moment and the possible impact of that if they don't even know the situation at the moment?
We should probably be very clear here about the title of the book so that people can go away and find it if they want to read it. So it's Farm to Fork, The Challenge of Sustainable Farming in 21st Century Britain. It's interesting, I think, from many perspectives, because it's a book that I think farmers would enjoy reading. And I'd like to chat to you about the kind of the feedback that you've had from the farming community from the book. But as you've said, it's also a book that is in a non-patronising way. It is educational. It's teaching people about the season, I suppose, of farming and all of the different sectors, and giving people, the general public, a deeper idea of what farming is and why it does what it does. So when you set out to write it, who in your mind was the intended audience for the book then? Was it the general public in order to give them a deeper understanding of what farming delivers?
As you said previously, I'm sure a lot of farmers will read the book, and I have had a lot of farmers getting in touch with me and saying that they've bought the book, they've read the book. But yeah, the person I had most in mind was the non-farming public, and that's why I guess I set out to keep things very simple, to talk about the farming year through the seasons, so starting in autumn and moving through to harvest in the summer. The key thing I was really trying to achieve was to do it without jargon. So really important to always explain absolutely everything, in a really simple way. To absolutely, as you said, to not be patronising at all, and to just really explain, the basics of what goes on the average British farm. And in doing that, I'm conscious that I perhaps have described a farming environment which certainly won't describe every single farm in the UK. I talk about my farm, I talk about the way that we rear beef on our farm, the way we have traditionally grown our crops on our farm. Now, in 5 years' time, perhaps that very traditional arable system that I describe, that we have used for decades, will no longer be that way. I do discuss, the more modern developments around regenerative agriculture, for example, and how farmers are working to bring more habitat creation back onto their land. But, ultimately, I was trying to describe the basics of cultivation, of planting. What I really wanted to get into were things like, why do farmers use artificial fertilisers? Why do farmers use plant protection products, pesticides? Because, again, that's something which sometimes I think we perhaps shy away from as an industry, but I wanted to explain why those products in the vast majority of arable situations in the UK are so important and why we use them. What is the benefit to people of having, affordable, healthy and safe food, of using those products, whilst also, of course, admitting that there are disadvantages, there are potential dangers from using those products in terms especially of course, environmental pollution from things like nitrates. But again, important just to explain the real basics and to explain it from a farmer's point of view. But it's great as well to have had so many farmers read it. And also, I was kind of bracing myself, with tin hat on, that I was going to get a lot of negative feedback from that's not how I do it here, that's not how we do it, why haven't you talked more about this or that? But the feedback's been really positive, and I think that's great. I think people are sort of understanding that the audience that it's primarily aimed at, and again, just trying to get those basic points across. And again, just trying to explain to people, why they should care, and also going into things such as Brexit. What impact has Brexit had on agriculture, on future agricultural policy? What impact might poor trade agreements have? What impact does global warming have, and what are British farmers trying to do to play their part to try and head the worst of climate change off with net zero, etc. And it was great to have NFU President Minette Batters honour me with a foreword to the book, which was really kind of her.
A very passionate forward, because that was obviously the first bit I read, and it's amazing. Now, obviously, you're kind of probably a little bit like me in that probably the majority of your connections, work-related connections, are within agriculture or rural industry. So, did you find or are you continuing to find one of the challenges of having written the book is to actually get it out to that wider non-farming, perhaps more urban audience, because that's a group that is kind of harder to reach when your connections are very much within kind of more rural industry. So how's that been going, and what assistance have you had to try and get that the book out there to the masses?
So the publisher Quilla Books have done a good job, obviously getting in touch and trying to get the message out there. It's been reviewed in things like Country Life. It's had a lot of reviews in the farming press, which perhaps proves your point more. It's available, like I say, it's in bookshops, it's in it's on high streets, it's on Amazon, it's on Waterstone. It's available in all these places. Yes, inevitably, I think a lot of farmers have bought, and it's great. I mean, please, if you're a farmer and you want to read about farming, I know farmers love reading about farming. There's nothing farmers like reading about more. It's probably all most farmers do read about.
Very true.
So please do buy it. But no, it is a challenge perhaps sometimes to reach that wider audience. Of course, now what we're seeing with Clarkson's Farm cut through to an incredible degree to the non-farming public, and that is superb. And of course, Clarkson's also got a book out, and that will, I'm sure, be hugely popular over Christmas, and I'm sure it will outsell me 10-1. And that's great. I mean, because, again, Clarkson's doing a great job of explaining exactly what I'm trying to do, which is to explain the realities of modern farming to the British public. I'm really hoping that will instill in people a desire to learn more about the realities of British farming.
Well, I think we're similar in our goals. We produce this podcast. Mostly rural people listen to it, but we would love more non-rural people to listen. But I suppose its very name appeals so much more to the rural community, and same with your book. But we're always saying to people, if you listen to the podcast and you find it interesting, even if it's just some of the episodes, tell a non-farming neighbour, tell the teacher at your child's school that there's something of educational value in here. And when it comes to your book, I'm just thinking, I have just become very involved in RET, which is the Royal Highland Education Trust, who are obviously educating school children all about food and farming. And it just occurred to me that actually, if we're listening, we might be farmers, but if we bought a copy of your book and gifted it to our primary schools, then that's giving children who aren't necessarily from a farming background the opportunity to read it and learn more. I think we are the only farming family in our primary school, because we're mostly in a sort of commuter village from Edinburgh. So there are many, many children in that school who could benefit and learn from reading your book. So it's about us as farmers spreading the word kind of on your behalf, I suppose, and getting the book out there to non-farming people.
Well, that's very kind. And we can all do that in whichever way that we are sort of most skilled to do. You look at people such as Tom Martin, for example, who started the Farmer Time initiative, which takes farming directly into primary schools twice a month. For 15 minutes, farmers talking directly to those primary school children, exactly as you've just outlined. That is so important, because we've all seen the stories, and I remember from my childhood, there is a very strong impulse by some people to trash the reputation of British agriculture, and they go to schools to do it. There is an awful lot of misinformation. There's an awful lot of, frankly, just whether it's willfully misleading children, or I think more often it's people who just don't know themselves, but they have a very small amount of knowledge. That can be very dangerous. And they go into schools, and you see all of this stuff, kids coming out of school from a farming background and saying, Mummy, Daddy, today I was taught that farmers are responsible for climate change and we should all be eating, corn. And if we do that, everything will be fine. And that can be a very insidious influence on young minds. So the more we can do to tell the truth and tell the positive story of British agriculture, then the better that is for everyone, and for our industry in the long run. And that's really up to each of us to do that.
Definitely. The book is very realistic. It's very matter of fact, as well as being interesting. But it's also, I think, pretty positive. It's somebody described in a review which I read. I thought it was really lovely. It says, at its core, this book is a love letter from one farmer to an entire industry, which I thought that was really sweet. But ultimately, yes, it's realistic, but you see a positive future in terms of, not just in terms of agriculture, but in terms of how agriculture can tell its story to food consumers. Obviously, everybody is a food consumer. Food is our most vital commodity, and it's those people who consume food, i.e. everyone, who needs to be hearing about this. So when it comes to the future and positivity, what are your feelings and thoughts on that?
I think that we do have such a positive story to tell in this country. Clearly, we have improvements we need to make. We are a long way still, I think, from our goal of being a net zero industry. And frankly, we need to, of course, move beyond net zero to be a carbon sink for the wider economy, for those parts of the economy which are going to be incredibly hard to decarbonise. And we can always improve. We can always improve welfare. We can always improve our environmental impact. We can always improve. But we are already operating at a relatively very high level globally, and we are also increasingly aware of the complete lack of any motivation in some parts of the world to improve. We see deforestation rates are increasing all around the world. We're seeing more virgin rainforest being cut down for soy production, for beef production. Now, you offer me a beef burger produced in the ashes of our planet's lungs versus a vegetarian option, and I will take the vegetarian option. There are unsustainable ways of producing our food, but just as there's unsustainable ways of producing beef, there's also sustainable ways of producing beef. But there's also completely unsustainable ways of producing, plant-based products.
Yes,
avocados, almonds being grown in deserts using huge amounts of pesticides, huge amounts of groundwater. These are not sustainable food sources, and we're kidding ourselves if we think that just because something is a plant, then it is good for the environment. Now, I am positive about the future. There's a huge number of enthusiastic, passionate young people still desperate to make their mark on the industry. I'm a trustee of an organisation called the Plum Foundation, set up by Lord Henry Plum to help young people get their first step on the ladder into the farming industry. And I'm always humbled by the passion and the drive of these people who are willing to effectively, work for nothing and work 100-hour weeks just because they want to be a part of the industry. And if you've got people who are that passionate, then we've got a bright future. The problem is that government is looking set to cut us off at the knees. Now, in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, the governments there have taken a more pragmatic view of our leaving the Common Agricultural Policy and the financial implications of that for farming. In England, of course, we're pushing ahead full bore with the agricultural transition period and the phase out of the basic payment scheme. Now, that's obviously a completely different and long conversation in and of itself. But my concern is that with losing the financial certainty that BPS gives farmers, with having our domestic standards and costs increased, in our public money for public goods future, and in having our markets thrown open to competition from food that it would be illegal to produce here, and the government is dead set on allowing that food to be imported. There are going to be no restrictions on the imports that are coming into our country. My concern is that our world-leading industry in this country, with a great story to tell, with passionate people, with this huge ambition to be part of the climate change solution while providing healthy and affordable food, is going to be blown out of the water by a government which, frankly, doesn't seem to care about those things, and they just want quick and easy trade deals, and they want to greenwash domestic policy. And it doesn't have to be like that, and it's not too late, and we can change it. We just need to get, as we saw last summer, we need to get public support behind us. We had 1 million signatories to the NFU's Food and Trade Standards petition, and we need to continue harnessing that support, because that's the only thing that governments seem to respond to these days. Overwhelming public indignation when clearly they are doing the wrong thing. So that is my view on where we are at the moment. We can have such a thriving agricultural industry in this country, which will provide benefits not just for food production and food security, benefits for the environment, benefits for the NHS and for health, and for the economy and wider employment and the supply chain. But we need to have the support of government to achieve that, because farming cannot exist in a bubble, in a high wage, high cost economy, with complete unilateral free access to our food markets. We need to have that support around us from government.
Now, aside from the obvious call to action, which is going by Joe's book, what is the key call to action there that that us as rural dwellers can do to help the general public to better understand the farming cycle and the benefits that farming delivers for our entire country?
Well, for farmers and for people within the sort of wider industry, it is to at every possible stage to make the case, whether it's to your MP, whether it's to the public, whether it's writing in your village magazine, whether it's calling the local TV station or radio station to come to your farm to cover an interesting story. Don't wait for them to come to you. News outlets are always looking for local stories. Contact them, get them to come and see something interesting or important that's going on your farm. It's just so important for us as an industry. There's so many of us. If you see something being said on radio or TV which is clearly nonsense, contact them, get on, and again, you'd be surprised how often you'll be put on to rebut nonsense rather than just sitting grumbling perhaps in your tractor cab. And of course, embracing the future in terms of high quality, high welfare, highly sustainable food. As an industry, that's our future. We're not going to compete scraping the bottom of the global barrel. We're going to have to move into that even more sustainable future. So we need to embrace that. Look to buy British, especially the red tractor. Now, the red tractor is somewhat controversial within the farming community for various reasons, but ultimately it is a guarantee, if you see the red tractor on that food packaging, that it was not only produced in Britain, it was processed in Britain as well. That is a British product, and that is... we need the public to support us by buying British. Just because it's got a Union Jack on it does not necessarily mean it's British, bizarrely. And, people need to put pressure on their political representatives, to do the right thing when it comes to food farming and trade. But the other thing, of course, is just, seek out more information on food and farming, on British food and farming, and on how they do it in other parts of the world. Read books, read articles, follow farmers on social media. Just take the time to appreciate why it's important to know where your food comes from, because the danger is, if we don't, then we won't know what we've lost perhaps until it's gone. And the countryside will look very different, and the amount of food that we're able to produce in this country will look very different. We're seeing at the minute with the pig industry what the impact can be of really poor decision making at a government level.
I know, yeah, you touched there on labelling, and I used to work for NFU Scotland, and way back then and still now, that's such a bugbear of mine. I inadvertently bought Australian beef jerky not that long ago because there was a huge Union Jack on the front of the packet. And it just makes my blood boil, because many people, perhaps not enough people, but many people have got good intentions, and if they're misled by confusing packaging, then those good intentions are going down the drain, and it's just so infuriating. So yes, buy British. If you're in Scotland, buy Scottish. Look for Scotch beef, Scotch lamb, etc., etc. I'm sure many of people will be supporting the whisky industry over the next few weeks with Christmas around the corner. But Joe, I really, really appreciate your time. As we said at the beginning, you're wearing many hats. I don't know, do you have a second book up your sleeve? Is that keeping you busy, or are you going to take a break from writing for a while? I'm
going to take a break for a while. I do have some other ideas, but yeah, it's the first book was put together in about 5 months.
Was it? And was that during lockdown?
So it was earlier this year. So from sort of January to May, I put the book together.
Gosh,
and that was
a really intense time.
It was intense. A second book will be written somewhat at a more relaxed pace, I hope. But no, thank you very much for having me on. It's been great talking about not just the book, but also of course about how important it is that we look to back British farming and our high domestic production standards.
Yeah, and so if you're listening and you live in a rural area, please do buy a copy of Joe's book, even if it's not for yourself. Perhaps you could give it to a non-farming neighbour, or as I said before, perhaps you could donate a copy to the local library or your primary school or high school, because the more people, I think, read something like this in a easily digestible and straightforward manner, the more we all benefit, because whether you're 90 or 9, I think there's always more you can understand about the food that you consume and the farming that goes on behind it. So as somebody else said, these are not my words, but somebody else said this in relation to your book, Joe. It says, everything a modern farmer wishes the general public know about farming. So I think that pretty much sums it up. So we can help spread the word by getting more people to read it. So thank you very much, Joe. I really appreciate you talking to us, and I think everybody will find this really fascinating. So thank you again.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for again putting out a podcast like this, which we're all trying to achieve the same thing. So thank you.
Joe Stanley, huge thanks to him. Joe's book is called Farm to Fork. That's it for this episode, and in fact for this year. As you might hear from my voice, I'm suffering from COVID at the moment, so I'm going probably back to bed or the sofa. But I really appreciate you listening. Big thanks to everyone who has supported us by sharing and recommending the OnFARM podcast with others throughout this year. Every time someone does that, it's so helpful in keeping the podcast going, growing our audience, bringing in new people to hear these valuable messages. And so I take every chance to wish you a very happy Christmas and New Year from Monty, myself, Dave, our producer, and everyone here behind the scenes at OnFARM. Wishing you all the best. We'll be back with more OnFARM in 2022. But meantime, Merry Christmas.